amazing book appeared in through my letterbox, which has set me on fire. Financial inclusion, really simple phrase, which is obviously all about including people within a financial system, right? That's what it says. So underneath that, there's a bigger question, which is which financial system? What's the socioeconomic model that we're trying to include people within? And given that you've written, Rajiv, about international financial inclusion, not just the UK, there'll be financial systems that are completely different to the UK. But I'm gonna keep my comments mostly about the UK for obvious reasons. So, what economic model? And of course, underpinning that is really what's your politics. So, what view do you have of the individual versus the state? What view do you have of wealth and the role of assets versus potential for wealth creation? And what does wealth creation mean? So, is wealth creation about asset-based creation, or is it about personal ability to offer and to contribute to a functioning society? So these are all really, really important questions that underpin financial inclusion within which socioeconomic system, within which political framework. And of course, attached to all of that are your views of rights and justice, and whether you care about equality. And equality of what? Is it equality of opportunity, equality of outcomes, equality of inputs? You know, these are all really tricky things that you start to draw out in different ways. So we look at the data and say, where is there evidence of harm? And then of course you need to kind of to drill into, well, what harm? What kind of harm? And why is it harmful, this thing that you're looking at? So as the Financial Inclusion Commission, when we're thinking about it, we're trying to say, well, let's roll back from politics, because we're all come from a different political spectrum, or we're across the political spectrum. What goal are we aiming for? And so you can see within the Financial Inclusion Commission that we talk about people being able to make the best use of their money across their lifetime. And in a way, that's an attempt to kind of depoliticize the kind of the agenda, and to say, actually, if we do this well, then irrespective of which government is in and what your political views are and what your even socioeconomic models are, then people should be able to meet basic needs. And those basic needs are, you know, to be able to have a safe place to live, so housing, and you cover housing really well in your book, be able to feed their children, be able to feed themselves, and not just feed them, you know, to kind of have enough calories to survive, but in a way that allows people to thrive, to actually tackle the impact of poor nutrition on life expectancy, for example. So, you know, we consider that good financial inclusion should lead to a lack of food poverty, which should in turn lead to better life outcomes. And then there's opportunity. So you want people to be able to access education, you want people to be able to access training. And increasingly within this particular economic structure that we're living within, that costs more and more all the time. So thinking about how does financial inclusion help people to access financial education, to access training opportunities, and to be able to get into good work. What does good work look like? Now, all of these are debatable, depending on where you sit on the political spectrum, depending on which kind of view you take about economic structure. You're going to have different views on these. And so as the Commission, we try and debate those and work out, well, where can we shift the agenda and how can we make that happen? There's no doubt that at least for the last decade, and if we're really honest, for the decade before that too, the economic model in this country has been increasingly moving towards a neoliberal and financialised position. A neoliberal economic agenda really essentially places individuals in the role of consumer, to be mined for their money and to be fueling an economic system rather than being served by it. And I think that's a really important part of the discussion. Does the economic system serve people, or do people serve the economic system? The competitive market model has been driving so much of the decisions that firms make. and also that government and regulators make. So where we are in this country right now, I would say, is that we have a view, a kind of a generalized view, that competition leads to the best outcomes. But the minute you do any 101 course on economics, you learn that the supply and demand model doesn't work. Because actually the supply and demand model around price and productivity shows you that an awful lot of people fall below the price point that most firms are going to want to serve. And so again, this is where financial inclusion comes in. We look at to what extent is the supply and demand model leaving too many people, or in fact anyone, below the point of supply, and how do we tackle that? So in a policy agenda, I think financial inclusion becomes necessary once you can identify the people that the market isn't supplying in its current structure. How can we find alternatives? Now, you discuss in the book the need for the welfare state, and of course, Toynbee Hall would say that the welfare state primarily began at Toynbee Hall with Clement Attlee and William Beveridge living and working and volunteering at Toynbee Hall and really exploring the gaps in provision, and then taking that forward and in government, in their roles in government, and saying what we need is a market and state collaboration primarily, that when people can't be served by normal market forces, the state recognises the dignity of the individual, the responsibility to the individual of the collective, and steps in to meet their needs. One thing that we definitely know is that when we watch financial services firms in particular, they primarily prioritise shareholder returns. They primarily prioritise profits. And you raise this really well in the book. Now, what that means in practice is that people go without access to insurance and then are criticised when something happens and they have no insurance to fall on. And we regularly hear people criticised for not having had insurance when no affordable insurance was made available to them. Likewise, people are criticised for not having savings, and yet they don't have an income high enough under the current living costs to be able to save. Likewise, we had over the last 3 recessions, debt solutions that tied people into debt repayment for the next decade, instead of helping them build their own financial independence. And when those people then return for debt advice, they are criticised as somehow being insufficient or incapable. And yet actually the truth is they didn't have enough money in the first place to pay the debt, and therefore being tied into 7 years of debt repayments was naturally going to force them into long-term poverty. And what's underpinning that market structure lies in the Companies Act. And the Companies Act makes it necessary by legislation for a board to prioritise the interests of shareholders. And as you rightly say in the book, too often that is narrowly defined as profits. But the Companies Act doesn't say that it has to be narrowly defined as profits. It also requires that boards can take into consideration the long-term interests of the company and the long-term interests of stakeholders. We could have a government and a regulator who push harder on Article 172 of the Companies Act and asked companies to evidence how they're prioritising the wider views of stakeholders, not just profits. But we don't have that. So there is a political view there, and there is a mechanism already in place for government and regulators to have a different view of financial inclusion, the kinds of views that you discuss so well in the book. Essentially, we need to think about a range of different, a kind of set of criteria. Our preferred economic model, our analysis of what's wrong, and where do we get that analysis from? Are we relying on data, or far too often are we taking assumptions? I remember listening to someone from BACS, the organisation that runs direct debits, where they had research that showed that low-income consumers do not like direct debits. And their chosen solution was to educate low-income consumers about direct debits. But we all knew that education wasn't the problem. That when a low-income consumer said, I don't like direct debits because if I don't have the money in the bank account to pay the direct debit on time, and I can't stop the direct debit, it will be taken, I will be penalised by the bank for having a returned payment. And if I've got several direct debits set up on my account, which is the perceived wisdom, I will have several fees on my account for returned payments. And now I will be somewhere in the region of £10 to £50 in debt for a single time in my month when I didn't have enough money in my account. So we've known that for over a decade. And it is only now that Request to Pay as an alternative push payment has been developed and is being slowly rolled out. The nudge theory, it's really good work, but it's taken on a myth of its own that nudge is the only appropriate tool and that we need to nudge everyone. Well, sometimes we just need to change the system so that people aren't at risk of falling down a deep hole, because people don't naturally fall down deep holes. We need to change the system as well as nudge. So we do need to share good analysis and understanding of what the driver's exclusion are. And I want to close with a quote from Muhammad Yunus and from his book Banker to the Poor, which is what set me on this journey. He says, "If you find the Grameen story credible and appealing, I would like to invite you to join those who believe in the possibility of creating a poverty-free world and have decided to work for it. You may be a revolutionary, a liberal, or a conservative. You may be young or you may be old, but we can all work together on this one issue. Think about it." And for me, that's where I come down on your book. Financial inclusion means all these different things to different people. How are we going to judge its success? By outcomes. Do people have, one, enough money to live on? And two, does it serve them well, rather than them serving the interests of firms and their shareholders?